Hello, I'm Kathy Clower. Welcome to Worth Quoting, a lecture series presented by Open Campus at Florida Community College of Jacksonville. Today we have as our guest Joe Laufer, who is, and I'll have to read this, President of the International Columbian Quincentenary Alliance. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Welcome.
I'm glad to be here in Florida.
Thank you. I understand that you are known as a Columbus mythbuster.
Well, I guess you can say that as we approach 1992 and the 500th anniversary of the so-called discovery of America. I guess it's better to say the encounter of the European and American cultures. There are a lot of programs being developed dealing with that celebration or commemoration, and I got involved early on as an educator and tried to help summarize those myths that have come down to us to the present day about Columbus, and trying to clear the air in anticipation of 1992.
And some of the myths I'm going to ask you, did Columbus set out to prove that the earth was round?
I guess that was one of the things we all learned in school, that the sailors and Columbus were afraid they might fall off the end of the earth. But the fact is that everybody in 1492 knew that the earth was round. They just didn't know how big around it was. So the problem was more a case of size than of the problem of a flat earth. So there was no person who was educated who didn't believe that the earth was round.
But did Columbus set out to found a new world?
Not that either. His main goal was simply to find a passage, a sea passage to the Orient. That was the bottom line. He had no idea that he was going to find a new world. What happened basically was that because of the fall of Constantinople, Europe became somewhat landlocked. And there was a need to break out of the constraints of the territory. And there were several ways of doing it. One was to sail around Africa to get to the Orient, since it was difficult to get around the land now because of the Moors. And the other was Columbus's idea to sail across that uncharted ocean. And so his intention was simply to find a sea route to the Indies, or China and Cathay, or Japan.
What about Isabella? Did she sell her jewels? Was that...
It's another one. I guess that goes back to Washington Irving. Washington Irving was the first serious American biographer of Columbus. He wrote in about 1828. He did his research in Spain in the archives of the Indies. And one of the things that cropped up in his work was that Queen Isabella agreed to pawn her jewels in order to finance the voyage of discovery, or which has subsequently been called the voyage of discovery. The fact is that she may have offered, but the town of Palos, which was the little town in southern Spain from which Columbus departed, owed the crown some debt of some sort, and so they forced them to pay back the crown by giving Columbus two ships, the Nina and the Pinta. The Santa Maria was financed probably by Italian bankers who were so interested in reestablishing trade with China. So Queen Isabella didn't have to pawn her jewels, nor did she.
What about the crew? Can you tell us a little bit about the crew that was on the ship?
Sure. One of the myths, again, about the crew was that it was made up of criminals and that they mutinied before they arrived in the New World. The fact is there were only 4 criminals on board the Santa Maria, and they were what I'd call minor criminals. One of them committed a minor crime, and the 3 others tried to free him from prison. But yet, somehow or other, history books have said that the entire crew was made up of criminals. This crew was a crew of seasoned sailors. Columbus was a foreigner. First he came from Genoa and then lived in Portugal for a good number of years. So when he came to Spain, he didn't know anybody who could put a ship together, a crew together. So he had to turn to the Pinzon brothers, Martin Alonso Pinzon, who was the captain of the Pinta, and his brother Vincent, who was captain of the Nina. They got him his sailors, most of them from the same 2 towns in southern Spain, Palos and Moguer. So most of the sailors the crew were seasoned sailors, good sailors, and only 4 criminals.
That's interesting. What about the size of the ship?
It's another interesting thing. When people see the ships, and they're going to get a chance to see them during the Quincentenary, they'll be coming up the coast of Florida, as a matter of fact. The ships are extremely small. I do school assemblies, and I get the kids involved and let them see how small the ships really are. They're about the size of a tennis court.
Oh my goodness.
And I have 40 kids stand up to demonstrate how 40 people could fit on a tennis court.
Which
and
was
that's
the size of the crew, roughly?
The Santa Maria was 40 ships alone, 40 sailors alone. The Pinta had 26, and the Nina had 24. So a total crew, counting Columbus, of 90 sailed on the voyage in 1492. But to put 40 kids on a tennis court really makes it come alive for them. They get a sense of how really small these ships were.
Seasick?
Yeah, well, the trip over wasn't bad at all. It's amazing. It was almost like a cruise. And it's interesting because in 1992 they're going to reenact the voyage of discovery, and they're postponing it. They're not leaving Spain at the exact date that Columbus left because it's the height of hurricane season.
Oh my goodness.
Columbus, had he known that back then, would not have left when he did. And so, but the fact is that he didn't run into any hurricanes on the way over. On the way back, however, they did. The Nina and the Pinta were the only ships returning because the Santa Maria was shipwrecked on Christmas Eve by an accident, a fluke really. But the Nina and the Pinta encountered 2 hurricanes on the way back to Spain in February, March in there. And they were separated, and neither one knew that the other survived.
So it wasn't a dangerous trip on the way over at all then?
The trip over was relatively easy, and it was only 33 days. People think that, you know, the sailors started getting upset and attempted mutiny on about the 30th day. Well, that's when it did happen, about the 30th day, and it was just a minor concern about the wind. But some people think it was a much longer voyage, but 33 days is not a long voyage.
So many myths. That's really interesting.
That's right, and some of the teachers, you know, I do this in schools, and they wonder why it's not the teachers that are concerned, but people ask, how come we're not taught the truth? And the fact is the teachers really don't have a chance to focus on one event in history. They do really go over the Columbus story very quickly, and it's events like the Quincentenary that are going to allow us to focus on it a little more. So I don't fault the schools. I guess we fault Washington Irving for primarily having sort of novelized, dramatized the story of Columbus in his first major work, from which our history books picked up their information.
But you became interested in it.
I became very fascinated. I'm a kind of an events person, and I used to teach Spanish in high school. I taught high school Spanish in Pittsburgh, and that, of course, got me interested in Spanish culture, and you always have to study about Columbus in that context. And as 1992 approached, I thought, I want to really get involved in this. I like working with young kids, and I used to do school assemblies with other projects, and this became an ideal vehicle for getting kids interested in this phase, this aspect of history. And they're going to hear an awful lot about it in 1992 through the media, and so I decided that I would focus on it full time. And that's what it's all about right now for me.
So were you surprised when you discovered some of these things that people had been thinking?
Really, I was, because I had to do a lot of research and get into it, and I believed some of the myths myself. A number of things are happening by this interest. As you know, there's a kind of a concern about the Indian population, Native Americans, concerned about celebrating this Quincentenary because of what happened to Native Americans. I think that's a very vital issue to be discussed during the Quincentenary. And I've been doing a lot of research into that whole area of the Indian factor. And that's something that I think should be discussed. And this is one of the values of commemorations like this, to let us focus and put history in perspective.
Absolutely. Very interesting. We're sitting in front of this beautiful painting.
That's right.
Could you tell us a little bit about this painting?
Yeah, that's part of the educational program that I'm involved with. And that's the painting was done by Emanuel Leutze, a painter who's famous not so much for any Columbus paintings, although he painted 6 or 7 of them, but he's famous for his Washington crossing the Delaware. And that's his most famous American painting. And the interesting thing about Emanuel Leutze is that he was a German immigrant to this country. At the age of 10, he came, 9 or 10, he came to the city of Philadelphia. And he immediately became fascinated by our heroes, George Washington and Christopher Columbus. And what he did was he was very concerned about the European situation, the lack of democracy over there, and he decided then to focus on this concept of freedom that he saw in America. He went back to Germany, and he executed most of his paintings while in Germany, most of them dealing with American themes. And this one was one of his last Columbus paintings, painted in 1855, shortly before our Civil War. And it's called The Departure of Columbus from Palos in 1492. And it's really one of the greatest paintings of Columbus, and it has been hidden in private collections since about 1855 when it was first painted. It only recently emerged from a private collection, and the owners have decided to make it a part of the Quincentenary celebration. The original painting, right now as we speak, is in Columbia University in an exhibit there.
So this will go on tour with you?
This mural representation is a much larger reproduction. This is a 8 by 10 reproduction. The actual painting is about 4 feet long and 3 feet high. Is going to be on a national tour also through the Smithsonian, all during the Quincentenary. And as I say, it's currently in Columbia University. And it was recently unveiled in Europe and then brought to this country. But this tour is going to schools throughout the country. That's why we're here in Jacksonville. We're doing a number of school assemblies, and this painting will be the focal point of those assemblies. And we use the theme of the painting, the message of courage that is displayed in the action of Christopher Columbus as he's about to depart for this momentous voyage, even though he didn't know what he was going to accomplish by it. And it's a great teaching tool for children.
It's absolutely magnificent. Can we take a closer look?
Sure can.
Okay.
I'd like to give you a tour.
All right, let's do that. Well, this is magnificent. Can you tell us about the painting?
Well, certainly. Most people are familiar with Leutze's Washington, because the minute you look at the Washington crossing the Delaware, you're focused right on George Washington. And with this one, as you can see, the minute you walk into a room and this painting is before you, you're focused on Christopher Columbus. And that was one of the ways that Leutze painted his masterpieces. Let me show you how our eye is drawn to Columbus. Leutze was a master at using triangles, and as you can see, the painting itself is a kind of a triangle with Columbus at the apex. But they're little things. You can go right up the arms of this child, the arm of the priest here, the arm of Columbus's son, and you go right up to Columbus's face. And then almost everything points to Columbus. You can take this part of the sail, and you can look at the oars, the way they focus up. Almost everything, and up the backs of these people, this whole group of people, pull your eye right up to Columbus. And then Leutze would also use mini triangles throughout his paintings. Here's a triangle of sailors, just 3 of them together, and they just come up together in a triangle. Even the people in the little boats alongside are in triangles. And so that's one way in which Leutze would draw your attention to the central figure of the painting. But let's talk about that central figure for a second. It's interesting, the gesture of Columbus. It's his left hand. And that is a very familiar gesture in paintings of the Italian school. And mainly, the one that comes to mind is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel painting of the creation of Adam. And so that's a creation kind of a symbol. Columbus is pointing to what is going to be the new world. He doesn't know it. But he sort of has a sense of destiny there, and that's exactly the image that Leutze is trying to get across, the image of destiny. And that's the message that we try to bring to the kids as we bring this around the country to schools. We focus on the message of the painting, the idea of risk-taking, of courage, and of persistence and perseverance. To get to this point, it took Columbus about 15 years of struggle. He had his idea 15 years earlier. He tried to convince the king and queen of Portugal, the king of Portugal, and was turned down. Then he went over to Spain, and finally, after about 8 years there, he made his point and was given permission to leave with the 3 ships.
What about the people in the boats? Now they have come to tell him goodbye.
Right, there are 3 boats, and there are various groups of people. I guess the most important ones saying goodbye that we might focus on is, first of all, his son. There's a great focus on that, of his son Diego. Columbus was a single parent at this point. His wife had died. He had a Portuguese wife, and his son was born in Portugal while Columbus was trying to make his point over there. And so Diego is about 10 years old here, and he has lost his mother, and he's going to be left behind. But there's a little bit of reassurance here, because there's a nobleman shown here. And these 2 priests are very important, because Columbus made his contact at the monastery of La Rábida. And these 2 priests, Father Juan Perez and Father Antonio Marchena, befriended Columbus and took his son in and taught him at the monastery of La Rábida. That played a very important role in the life of Columbus, and Leutze picked that up very nicely there with the Franciscans. There's a whole lot that could be said about the Franciscan influence on Columbus. He was a very spiritual man, and the Franciscans had a special interest in freeing the Holy Land, and Columbus made that one of his issues. He wanted to use the wealth that he obtained in trade with what he thought was going to be China to free the Holy Land, and he got that message from the Franciscans. And that also ties in with the flag on the front of the Santa Maria here. This is the Madonna of La Rábida, the monastery from which Columbus sailed. It was nearby, near this port of Palos in Spain. You mentioned the other people in the ships. This woman in white is very mysterious. And the eye is drawn first to Columbus and then to about 2 other characters, and this is one of them. And this woman, this man here is also one that sometimes catches the eye. But the woman is possibly, according to Leutze, it could be Columbus's mistress, or the woman he loved in Spain. After his wife died, he fell in love while he was waiting for the Queen's approval, and he had a child while in Spain. And some say that this is the child in the care of a nursemaid over here, his son Ferdinand. So Columbus had 2 children, Diego and Ferdinand. And there's a perfect triangle here. If you look at the woman, who's not even exactly looking at Columbus, and the child and Columbus, a perfect triangle, Leutze could have tried to make that a part of his painting to show that there was another child, a very important child in Columbus's life. Ferdinand would ultimately write his biography and sail with him on his 4th voyage to the New World. And so that's a definite possibility. Leutze was a master at history. He really studied his history.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. You said there were 2 or 3 priests here.
Yeah.
But there was no priest on the ship itself?
That's right. Many paintings of Columbus landing in the New World show a priest with him. He didn't bring any priests until the 2nd voyage. And that makes sense, and it again helps prove the point that Columbus wasn't in search of the New World. Why would he bring priests to China at this point if he was thinking that he was going to land in China, which already was established, and the Franciscans had already been to China around the time of St. Francis, many years before. And so Columbus didn't bring any priests with him. He brought them on the 2nd voyage to convert the Indians, whom he had found on what he thought were islands on the outside of China. Columbus never really believed he had landed in the New World. He even went to his grave thinking he was just on the outskirts of China. So that's another part of the story of Columbus that's rather interesting.
I get a sense of motion from this, just a lot of activity.
That's a very good point, the idea of the activity. There's a simultaneity of activity here. Everybody's saying goodbye. There are the emotions of farewells, probably the wives and the lovers of some of the sailors aboard ship. But there's also the activity of simultaneously lifting the sails, lifting the anchor, okay, and there are even some sailors over here hidden behind Columbus, probably lifting an anchor on the other side. And Columbus, of course, his gesture is the one that sets it all in motion. He sets the emotions in motion, he sets the action, and all of the farewells are shown there very, very clearly. There are a couple other things about some of the people on the painting that are interesting. There's somebody standing here in the back in the shade, so to speak, a bit fuzzy. The owner of the ship, Juan de la Cosa, and this is probably him. Leutze never explained all of the people but historians look at it and say, well, this is probably who it is. So this would probably be the owner of the ship wondering whether he's going to lose his ship, even though someone invested in it. Who knows? There are two people here that don't look like sailors, and that's true. There were two people on the Santa Maria who represented the king and queen and their interests, primarily gold and land. And so they made sure that if they were putting up any money, they were paying the sailors at least, even though they didn't pay for the ships. They wanted to make sure that that Columbus and his sailors didn't keep things for themselves. And the others, of course, are the sailors. The ship, of course, by Leutze had to use a bit of artistic license here. It's much smaller, even though the ships were small. There were 40 people on the Santa Maria. No how could there have been 40 people on this ship. But the fact is that this is part of the artistic license of Leutze. But he did get the message across that it was truly a very small ship.
That's absolutely marvelous. What are your plans for use with this?
Well, as you can see, it's a great teaching tool. You can get the children involved in the people in the painting, let them know that these were real live human beings that made this voyage. And we start with Columbus, of course, especially showing, first of all, the human aspects of him. Here he is saying goodbye to his son. And that's the human part of Columbus that we seldom see. But the other part is the moment of courage, and that's the message that we try to bring to the children. The fact that this was an important moment in the life of Columbus, in that whatever happened after this wasn't as important as this moment, because it brought up all the courage and all the risk-taking that was possible. And this gentleman over here seems to be summing it up. This guy's crazy. And so in the light of the attitude of the people, Columbus was truly daring, much like our astronauts. And I do a thing with the children and ask them whether they think these people were greater risk takers than the astronauts. At first they picked the astronauts, and then as they think about it more and they see the lack of communication, they didn't know where they were going, they didn't have the technology, they begin to agree that these people were much more in the area of risk takers. And so you can see why the people who are sponsoring this program, and it's being sponsored by the International Columbian Quincentenary Alliance, is an organization that I'm involved with, and our aims are to promote the educational aspects of the Columbus Quincentenary, to use it as a vehicle to deal with some very sensitive issues, like the treatment of the Native Americans is a very sensitive issue, and we feel that the Columbus Quincentenary is an opportunity to deal with that and to let children debate about it and think about it, and what would it be like today if we encountered a new culture and we were the invaders, so to speak. How would we treat those people? And the other part of it, of course, the aspect of the courage and the virtues shown by Columbus. So it's an educational tour, and an organization called New American Crossings out of California, Laguna Niguel, California, is actually putting up most of the money for this national tour. And it's just become a very positive activity. Schools are responding dramatically to it. As I mentioned, we were in St. Augustine, we're now here in Jacksonville, we'll be going to Orlando, and this is just Florida. And we're already booked in other states. We're in Mississippi, in Columbus, Mississippi. We're bringing it there in a couple of weeks. Notre Dame University, we're going to do a program out there all over the country. And it's being done, as I said, as an educational aspect of the Columbus Quincentenary, to show that there's more to it than just souvenirs and celebrations, that there's a message to be taught.
And you've been doing this, totally you will have done it for what, 2 years?
When it's all finished, we're just starting. We started in New Jersey, and this is the third stop on the tour that started in October. And it'll go on all through 1992. So we're talking about 2 years of education. We hope to hit most of the major school areas in the country. And it should leave a positive message of courage and destiny and risk-taking, we hope, with the young people who encounter it. I guess we've covered most of the people. There's another bit of irony in the painting. it's the idea of, there are several people who look totally disinterested. This gentleman here.
He was seasick.
He seems to be the oarsman, and you wouldn't want your oarsman to be seasick.
No.
And also the person over here, and this person even seemed to be that. Kind of a disinterestedness. In addition to people thinking that Columbus was crazy, there was a feeling in Europe at the time that it wasn't necessary to do anything else, to stay with Europe. And that's the important message, too, that Leutze picked up on. Europe had to break free of the constraints of the Middle Ages, so to speak. And so Columbus, this moment, is the beginning of modern times, in effect. The end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance, and modern times. And that's what Leutze captured, because he was an immigrant to this country, was fascinated by the freedom of this country, wanted to export it to Europe, and went back to Europe and painted most of his historic paintings in Europe. And his message was the idea of the westward movement of man to freedom. So he painted this one, Columbus making the first move westward, then Washington crossing the Delaware. Even though that was from west to east, the fact is that Washington brought freedom to the New World, in effect, by overthrowing the British. Then Leutze's other very famous painting is Westward Ho. Westward, the course of empire takes. It's on the stairway of the Capitol in Washington. It's a huge mural, and it's the pioneers traveling westward. So you can see what Leutze had in mind, this idea of the westward movement towards freedom, and our country symbolized that. And that's one of the messages of the Quincentenary, the idea that we're exporting the freedom that Columbus launched in 1492. America developed, and now it's being exported all over the world. So that's what Columbus started. That's why I get excited about Columbus.
I can see why. I can see why.
But he had his faults, as we mentioned, and the kids pick up on the fact, hey, he had a wife and a woman he didn't marry. And that's another little interesting story about Columbus's personality. Some say he got so proud when he came back after he was, in a sense, knighted when he came back to Spain, that she was below him. And so he never married her. And that's one of the flaws in his character. There were many other flaws. He was greedy.
He was had quite an ego, did he not?
Definitely. It almost shows in this painting, doesn't it, his egotism.
Quite proud, yeah.
A very cocky individual in that sense. Yes, he did have an unusual ego, and that's all part of the human aspects of some of our heroes. And that's another thing that we can point out during the Quincentenary. We use events to focus on an individual of history like that, and we show him with his flaws, with his warts, and with his good points. And that's what, some of the people who are opposed to the Quincentenary celebration, I see it as an opportunity for Native Americans to get their message out, to say, look what happened. Sure, this was an important moment, but as with all historic moments, there were some good points and there were some bad points. And so certainly the treatment of the Indians is nothing we're proud of. The Europeans today wouldn't be proud of it. But that was launched with Columbus. It was inevitable.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today. I certainly did learn a tremendous amount. I'd also like to thank the Jacksonville Historical Society and the New American Crossings for making this possible. This has been Worth Quoting with Joe Laufer. Thank you.